I'm going to tell you another story about your grandmother. Actually, this would be your great grandmother, my grandmother, your grandfather's grandmother, Grandma Betty. Shortly after the incident with the possum lunch, she decided she was tired of moving the family around every year or so, or even 6 months. And they now not only had one child, but two. Not only my dad, Daddy Bill, but also Aunt Helen. And she decided it was time to settle down. So she said, John Malcolm Pittendray, you find a town for us to live in, and we're going to stay put there. And they had been in North Carolina, and they liked this little town that used to be called Leaguesville, North Carolina, and they settled there for a long time. And about 10 years later, there was something called the Great Depression, and John Malcolm Pittendray lost his job. He stayed unemployed for 5 years. No work to do, no money coming in. And back then, the men did all the work and women worked at home. Very seldom did they work outside of the house. But Grandma Pittendray decided there was something that needed to happen in order to take care of the family. They had to have food on the table. They had to have a house to live in. So she decided she was going to open her guest room to someone who would pay rent to live in the house. And so that was the start of a great adventure in which she saved our family. That wasn't enough money coming in. So she moved all the kids into one bedroom. My dad, Daddy Bill, Aunt Helen, Aunt Florence, and Uncle Gordon. They all had to live in one big room, and all the other rooms were rented out to boarders who would come in and pay her money to live there. And she started serving breakfast to everybody, and she charged the boarders a little extra money. And that wasn't enough money after a time, so she started opening her dining room and her living room to people who wanted to come into her restaurant. She started a cafe. And then that wasn't enough, so she started serving meals at night as well. When things began to get a little bit better, and this terrible time that they called the Depression was coming to an end, and people were going back to work, and my grandfather, John Malcolm Pittendray, went back to work, things were still difficult. People stopped coming to the house to eat meals, so she began to make lunch for people, and she would put them in small paper bags, and the kids, my dad and Aunt Helen and Uncle Gordon and Aunt Florence, would go to the main gate of the mill and sell this food, these lunch bags, to the mill workers as they went to work. And that helped a little bit, but it wasn't enough. So one day she started making homemade potato chips, and everybody in town loved those homemade potato chips. The thing is, those were hard times, but Grandma Betty kept her family together, and she did whatever she could do to make sure that they still had a home, they had food on the table, and most importantly, they still had each other. Hello, grandson. This is your grandfather, and I've got another story about your grandfather's grandmother, Grandma Betty. She was a strong woman, and she did a lot to take care of her family. During the Depression, she ran a restaurant, she made food for people, made homemade potato chips to sell on the street. She did everything she could. Well, after the Depression was over and people went back to work, there was something called World War II, and it was a tough time for people. But the good news is that your grandfather's grandfather, John Malcolm Pittendray, was back at work in the textile mill, and he was making money again. And things were settling down, and they were doing pretty well. They were able to go out and buy their first car. It was a 1940 Ford Coupe. One day, she was driving this old car, and it had a habit of stalling, just coming to a stop. And she was driving her grandchildren, cousin Mac and cousin Sylvia, to church. And she came to an intersection and the car stopped, wouldn't go anywhere. And the guy behind her started honking the horn over and over and over. And she tried to get the car started. And she couldn't get the engine to turn over. And the guy behind her kept honking the horn. She finally had enough of this. She stepped out of the car, went to the other driver's car, opened his car door, and said, "Look here, young man, if you think that honking the horn will help get this car started, I'll sit in your car and I'll honk the horn at you." And she grabbed him by his ear and pulled him out of his car and dragged him to her car with cousin Mac and cousin Helen, or cousin Sylvia, Helen's two kids, still sitting in the back seat watching all this. She forced this stranger behind the wheel of her car, and she went back to his car and she began to honk at him. Well, the man tried to get the car started and it wouldn't start, and he finally came back and said, "Miss, I can't start the car, and I'm sorry that I was honking the horn." And so she got out of his car, and went back to her car, and he got back in his car. And the problem is, when the man tried to start his car, he realized that Grandma Betty had accidentally taken the car keys out of the car. You know, those keys used to fit in the car themselves before you could start them. And she had taken the keys with her by accident, I guess. And so the man had to go back to her. She was still trying to start the car, and she was just able to get it started before driving off. He stopped her and said, Miss, you got my car keys." And she said, "Well, if you want my car keys, you're going to have to apologize to my children." And so he apologized. He said, "Young man, young woman, I'm sorry that I made such a ruckus and honked my horn at your grandmother." And Grandma Betty said, "Do you always wear your hat when you apologize?" And she made him take his hat off, and he held it over his heart. And I think because he anticipated what Grandma was going to say next, he knelt on the ground and said, "Children, please forgive me." And she forgave him. The kids forgave him, and she drove off. Now, cousin Mac, who told me this story, says that for the rest of his life, when he was old enough to drive a car, he never honked the horn at a stalled car. He was always patient. What I really would like to know is, how did this man's wife, who was sitting in the passenger seat this whole time, how did she tell this story to her children and grandchildren?